Well, hello, and welcome back to my Stuarts vlog. This is episode 2, and in this episode we're going to look at just those first few years of Charles I's reign up to the start of personal rule, so 1625 to 1629. In the exam, you won't be able to be asked a question just about these 5 years, but they're quite helpful and significant in establishing some of those problems that Charles faces. And I would characterise the causes of the problems between Charles and Parliament in these years as focusing on religion, money, and power. If we start off with religion, just straightforwardly, that comes more to the fore, of course, with William Laud's reforms and problems with Scotland later on. But just right from the off, Charles I was an Arminian or sympathetic to Arminianism. I'll talk about religion later on in the vlogs and the differences between them. But essentially, Arminians thought that Catholics were not evil and that you could learn things from them and kind of borrow practices from them. So they liked things like art, and they saw beauty and creation as ways that God spoke to humanity, to people. Whereas the Protestants were much more focused really just upon God speaking only through the Bible. That's sort of simplistic, but but kind of helpful way of thinking about it, I think. The Arminians, more to the point, I think, were therefore were okay about Catholics and didn't slag off Catholics all the time. And that was kind of probably a relief to Charles, I guess, because he was married to a Catholic, and I think he probably just found that they fitted his mindset a bit better. There were growing concerns, though, from Parliament and from the Puritans within Parliament about Charles and his Arminians who looked Catholic, and that is a root of issues. More of a problem, though, in these first few years were to do with money and power. Now, you'll remember, hopefully, from last time that there's a war going on when Charles I comes to power. And that war had been, he had helped get England into that war. Parliament had been very much in favour of that war, but Parliament wanted a limited war, and Charles was looking perhaps to get involved a bit more than that. That leads to several military excursions in these first few years. In 1625, there's a naval attack on Cadiz. However, that ends in complete farce when the fleet finds a farm filled with vats of wine, and they imbibe lots of wine, and the whole thing just falls apart. The following year, a naval attack launched in 1626. In October 1626 is turned back due to bad weather. It was launched in the autumn, perhaps not the best timing. There then follow a succession of attempts to land an assault near La Rochelle or in La Rochelle. The first one in 1627 is actually at Rhe, R-H-E, near La Rochelle, is led by Buckingham himself, and again ends in farce when they discover that the ladders that they're trying to use to scale the tower at Rhe are too short. And that's just one way in which this attack is a complete disaster. They try again in 1628 to help out the Huguenots in La Rochelle. It's a failure. Charles I tries to press through with a third effort in October 1629 after the death of Buckingham. But again, that fails, and actually the French Catholics capture La Rochelle, and the Huguenots are driven out. Now, these things all cost money, and there's all the sort of money issues that Charles has with Parliament are all set in the context of this embarrassing failure. On the one hand, Charles says the reason that things are going so badly is because you won't give me the money. And actually, that's also true. He's trying to fund the Danes in their fight in Germany. He promised them £30,000, and not all of that gets there, and the Danes lose in Germany. So Charles says, look, you haven't given me the money, and how can we possibly fight this war properly if I've got one hand tied behind my back? On the other hand, Parliament looks at the administrative disasters and the failure of the attacks and says, why would we give you more money? You're wasting it all in this war, and not least in your incompetent leaders. And that's why they become so critical of Buckingham. So this kind of argument about money has a context also of like who's in charge and who gets to call the shots. I'm just going to take through kind of the relationship with Parliament and how that unravels again through the different years. So in 1625, Charles calls his first Parliament. They agree to give him £140,000 to help in this war effort. But they only offer him tonnage and poundage for 1 year. Now, traditionally, going back like the last 5 or 6 monarchs, they had been allowed to collect tonnage and poundage without any further permission for their whole reign. This is kind of like the way in which part of the ordinary revenue of monarchs. Now, there's perhaps Parliament were doing this because they were concerned about the spending of money. Perhaps it's been suggested that because there were very few MPs actually in Parliament that year because of an outbreak of plague, that they'd wanted to review it. It's certainly true that tonnage and poundage had changed in the previous few years because a number of more goods were being placed on the tonnage and poundage list, and it was ripe for review. However, either way, Charles does take this as an insult and a blockage to his ability to conduct foreign policy, which he saw as his area, without the restrictions and straitjacket that Parliament was trying to put him on there. He does call them back, but gets no further with that. In 1626, a second Parliament is brought about, and actually Charles tries to manipulate who appears in that Parliament by appointing several people like Sir Edward Coke and Sir Thomas Wentworth as sheriffs. Now that meant that they had to supervise the election and therefore couldn't stand. And so Charles is hoping to get rid of these few troublemakers, but what he actually discovers is that there are more troublemakers than he had suspected. And in fact, Parliament, when it meets, begins to talk about impeaching Buckingham, and Charles dismisses it without getting any more money. Because of that, he decides to instead impose a forced loan. Basically, he goes around demanding money off the wealthier subjects in England. He actually raises £260,000 quite quickly due to the vigorous nature of the forced loan, but a lot of people resist this and say that it's illegal. 76 people end up being imprisoned. The Lord Chief Justice is not sure if it's legal, and because of that, Charles doesn't actually, so these people arrested, doesn't actually bring them to trial, and that results in 1627 in the Five Knights case. The Five Knights were claiming that they could not be held in prison without being brought to, or being charged and brought to trial. That's the principle of habeas corpus. Actually, the Five Knights lose that case, but the whole thing sours the relationship between these wealthy subjects in England who are represented in Parliament and the King. The King thinks he needs to force this money out so they can conduct the war that he's meant to be fighting. Parliament thinks it's outrageous that he's doing it in such an aggressive and what they see as illegal or extra-legal manner. That leads in 1628 to a Parliament where there's a sort of sense of compromise perhaps being needed. They're both aware that they're reaching a point where things are breaking down. And Parliament does reach out to Charles here and offers him 5 subsidies, 5 tax packets, I guess, amounts of money, 5 subsidies, 5 taxation collections. But they link this to the petition of right, and their aim in the petition of right is to say to Charles that we want our rights and our liberties guaranteed. We don't want anything new or additional, but we want a guarantee that you're going to stand by those liberties. This is the word that they used a lot, that we feel are already guaranteed by our constitution. Charles responds to this in a typical Charles way by sort of accepting it, but in a very grumpy fashion, and it does very little to persuade Parliament that he actually is on board with them. And this leads into the remonstrance, where Parliament are critical. They remonstrate. They criticise Charles on a number of areas, particularly how lax he's been about clamping down on Catholicism. This feeds into the Arminian fears that they have. They criticise him for his reliance on Buckingham, and of course they criticise him for the shambolic nature of his foreign policy. They're also upset about the continued collection of tonnage and poundage, even though Charles is not supposed to be collecting it. Now, from Charles's perspective, there's no way in a time of war that he can give up half of his income, which tonnage and poundage contributed. And so he's saying, well, give it to me legally and I'll collect it legally, but I can't stop collecting it because I need that money. Parliament sees this as a breach of their rights and their relationship and their position. So again, this all reaches an impasse actually, and Parliament are dismissed. In this period, then in late 1628, Buckingham is actually assassinated or murdered in Portsmouth. He's actually preparing for the next attack on La Rochelle at the time. This, I think, is more of an emotional upset. Actually, there's a tremendous amount of relief in England, really, when Buckingham is killed, and some joy, and not all of that is disguised. It's extremely insensitive to Charles, who was big mates with Buckingham, relied on him, and saw him as a friend, an ally, and a companion in policy. And he was very upset, I think, as much as anything, about how that was portrayed, not least in Parliament. Nevertheless, by 1629, Charles was taking slightly more action against the Catholics. He'd brought the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, a Puritan, back into the Privy Council and was trying to sort of show a little bit of willing in the 1629 Parliament. But again, things break down, and actually Charles ends up dismissing that Parliament, and that's it, that famous incident where the Speaker is actually held in place. The Speaker comes to say, oh, we've been dismissed, and the MPs, or several of the MPs, hold the Speaker in place so that they can vote through 3 final grievances that they have. Again, their grievances are about religious innovation, about Charles bringing in Arminianism, seeming to be Catholic or sympathetic towards Catholicism, rather than standing up for the Protestant faith. They're angry about him continuing to collect tonnage and poundage, even though they've said that he's not allowed to. And this results in the arrest of several MPs, including Sir John Eliot, who infamously ends up dying in the Tower in 1632. And of course, although we're moving now into the period of personal rule, you've got a very sour relationship here between Parliament and Charles, based around these ideas of religion, and Charles having a different religion or different strand of religion to a lot of people in Parliament, around money, Charles continuing to collect these taxes without the permission of Parliament, and really fundamentally, I think, about power. Who is in charge and who has authority to make decisions and make the calls about what is legal and what isn't. Thanks very much, and next time we'll look at the personal rule. See you then.